call roll. Carolyn Campbell.
Here.
John Collins.
Here.
Carl Kaminsky.
Present.
Larry Smith.
Here.
Tracy Van Bergen.
Here.
Municipality, Keelan Noon.
Here.
Harry Caliban.
Here.
Did I say your name right?
No.
How do I say that?
Forget it, you'll never get it.
I've never got it right.
We did the same conversation 2 years ago.
Wayne Jett.
Yes.
Bob McMahon.
Here.
Jim Huff.
Present.
Christie.
Here.
Do we need to call the alternates on this? No. Okay. All right, so do I have a motion to approve the minutes from the last meeting? Carl Kaminsky moves. John Collins seconds. Sorry, Chris. All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay. I guess we move right into elections, which we have to do each year. I guess I'll open elections for motion for chairman. Anybody want to make a motion for chairman?
I move to nominate Jim Kearns as president.
I'll second it.
Okay. Anybody else from the municipalities want to take over this job?
You're doing it fine. Not gonna pawn it off that easy.
All right. Seeing no other nominations,
I make a motion to close the nominations.
okay. Moved and seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor of Jim Kearns?
Aye. Aye.
Opposed? Aye. Nominations for chairman. I move Tim Huft. Mayor Huntley.
I'll second.
Tracy seconds that. Any other nominations? Going once. Motion to close nomination.
I make a motion to close the
I'll
nominations.
second it.
Okay, all those in, aye.
Aye.
Anybody, all those in favor of Tim Huft? Aye.
Aye.
All right. Okay, now, this is something we have to do, I think, every year or every time the mayors change, right?
Well, I think it would be more so if we have new members. So in this case, we do have some changes and some different primaries and alternates. So it is to give the alternates an ability, if the primary can't attend for the municipality, if there's something on the table to be voted on, that they would have the ability to have that vote.
Okay. And we got into this a couple of years ago, for those that weren't here. Got into this a couple of years ago, one of the members called us out and said our alternates were illegal according to our rules, so we have to elect them at each time, change it. So, so do I have a motion to unanimous consent to appoint the commission members, the alternates, and Chris moves,
I'll second.
Carl seconds. Okay, I probably should do a roll call on this. I'll start with Christie,
Yes.
Tim Huft,
Yes.
Bob McMahon,
Yes.
Wayne Jett,
Yes.
Haig,
Yes.
Keelan Noonan.
Yes.
All right, Tracy Van Bergen,
Yes.
Larry Smith,
Yes.
Carl Kaminsky.
Yes.
John Collins.
Yes.
Carolyn Campbell.
Yes.
And I'll vote yes, so it is unanimous. Okay, did we have any public comment?
I don't think so. Is there anybody? I don't think so.
Okay, I do want to thank everybody for coming out today so we can get this out of the way, this formality.
Can we go now?
Actually, you can if you like, if your alternate's here.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen.
It's all you. They were serious.
They were.
I'll stay and represent.
Appreciate it.
Have a good one, Jeff.
Why didn't you take the big bus?
Any member comments? Okay. I guess we have action, we had to correct a typo in May's meeting.
So when you guys approved the calendar, there was a typo on the May date. I think we had May 26th. The calendar invite that went out to everyone is correct. It is the Thursday. So we just wanted to correct that on the record. I suppose this is another opportunity since it's been a few months, if you guys wanted to look that over. I know in the past, that March date with spring break and vacations has been difficult sometimes, but so it is, I suppose, another opportunity if anybody has any issues with the new year. Your calendars are probably, you know, more apparent to you now. So I guess it is another opportunity to discuss that. But the main issue is that we did have the May date was a typo, but on your calendars it is correct.
So I have PHCS that day.
On that
On
day?
the May.
Yeah, or on the,
What time is PHCS?
8:30, so that also means you don't get this room.
It's in this thing, huh?
So if I need to be here and Pam is here, she can run the meeting for a short while, but.
The only other option is alternate, push our time back an hour or something, but,
Time back and alternate date, up to the committee to,
all right, we'll get closer to that date and see what's going on.
you, leading up to it, you can always make changes, obviously, through
That's
the
the May.
bylaws.
Actually, that's the
one.
May.
Okay.
Is anybody else here on PHAs?
March
You're not on the call, right?
26.
Okay. Are you on that? Okay,
Yeah, the
All
March
right,
one's
so
okay. It's the
that's
May
the only
28th.
conflict we have. Is there a motion to approve this as stands? John Collins moves. Carolyn?
Yeah, I just have, observation, I know it's not a problem, on the 24th is also the budget, our annual budget meeting at 10,
September.
September 24.
I think we had that same thing last year,
We
but we
every
were
year,
done right
yeah.
away, right?
So,
You guys would know better than
yeah, no, it
me.
is, that we did that happened last time, so
Yeah,
I know
feel
it's, we started 8:30, that's not till 10, I'm just putting it out there, because that's usually, that budget meeting will be.
Thank you for
It's-
forward thinking.
It'll be motivation to keep on schedule to get out for our meeting.
And I gotta make sure I keep the agenda short.
Yeah, the agenda short, that kind of thing, yeah, right, just to kind of keep that in mind.
Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The motion carries. Action items, MCSC 2026, we just did that. Discussions, items, and possible action. What do you got on the thoughts here?
Well, are you moving to the 9.1
Yep.
item? Okay. So, thank you. This is the latest update. It's a very rough draft that incorporates the changes as they currently are moving through TAC to our stormwater detention portion. I've probably spent the last 3 months or so with TAC moving through this section and, trying to make progress. So this language here is rough, but I wanted to give you guys an update and get feedback. TAC has not seen some of this, especially that first section. It's basically stems from the last discussion that we had, so it's part of the process. I try to get some language in there and kind of massage that, get feedback. So it's not going to be perfect. I expect questions, definitely. And then my goal was, after we go through that, to kind of run through, I have kind of a narrative for those members that, might not have some of the technical background. I wanted you guys to feel comfortable in making a decision or being able to provide comments on these changes. And then there's a second part that deals with the section changes. So I was planning on just going through it and probably jumping around a little bit, but at any point, just feel free to stop me and ask questions. So just going through it here, this is Article 6, for runoff control, runoff rate reduction. This is a really minor change, but we're going to change the 20,000 square foot to a half acre. Everybody else uses a half acre. So the difference would be that a half acre is about 23,000 or so square feet. So not a real big change there, but it stays consistent. Most of the other language discusses an acre as an acreage. So that's one small change there. The next section would deal with the exemption. So here under I, the 1 acre or less, the 1 acre, I meant to cross that out. So this would be an exemption for any new impervious area up to a 10% increase. So the idea is if someone wanted to come in and put in up to 10% on their contiguous property area and try to avoid detention, this is how we determined would be the best way. So, and I'll go through in the detail in the packet, but the big change is in the previous language, the applicant had to demonstrate that there would be no resultant flood damage. And as you'll see in a little bit, flood damage has a very specific definition related to a structure. So we wanted to redefine that and go with minimal flood risk instead. With the idea that so the way this is intended to work is number 1 and number 2 would be items you would need to meet, so then you can use this simplified method. Or, and then it's supposed to be, or you can have a professional engineer run the calculation. And I think now what I'll do is I'd like to just jump into the narrative so it makes a little bit more sense for you guys.
So question, when it runs to a channel, downstream water elevation, runs to a channel, that's by any means, tile, anything?
Correct, which leads me straight into the narrative. And so here's the definition of flood damage that I laid out: a measurable rise in flood heights at a building currently subject to flooding, or flooding of a building not currently subject to flooding. So it's very interpretive on really what that means. So I just tried to lay out, there's no clear metric. This doesn't include driveways, parking lots, septic systems, anything that really wouldn't involve a building. So hence we wanted to replace the flood damage with minimal flood risks. This really stemmed from the idea of how flood hazard areas, we already have language in the SMO. It's guidelines from FEMA that really you don't want to increase water surface elevations more than 1/10 of a foot, which is about 1 inch. And again, if these are numbers we can change or modify depending on the different situations. But for right now, that's how we decided to move forward. So as part of that concept, we want to require that the development is not changing drainage patterns. If the drainage patterns are changing, then the existing conditions are going to act differently. And we wanted to make sure that it's discharging to how the ordinance defines a channel. So Jim, to your point, river, stream, creek, brook, branch. I highlighted flow path just because I feel like an engineer or anyone really can make the argument that anywhere water drops would be a flow path. It just seems a little bit broad. But slough, ditch, gully, so it is meant to be something defining. So what we would want to exclude is the neighbor that might be draining onto another neighbor, and it's kind of just still sheet flowing, and maybe there's a septic system there. There's no ditch or swale in between the properties. So that's kind of the situation we're trying to say that can't really exempt you in that scenario because there still could be issues if you're not draining to a known kind of location. So that was the big change. So with this, now we have a metric and we have parameters in place. So how do we achieve that? we, with the TAC, essentially looked at analyzing all rain events in the 100-year storm event from the 5-minute up to the 240-hour, and looking at which one would produce which duration would produce the highest peak flows. Normally, it's going to be right in this range, the 1 hour to the 30-minute. It's going to be one of these two events that typically will do that. So when you're comparing those peaks, then what you end up getting is a difference in that flow rate. So we would know, okay, there's a difference between those two flow rates, which then we can translate to just some known typical infrastructure, a pipe, a ditch, a swale, something along those lines. So what we considered was that most conveyance in the county, whether it be incorporated or unincorporated, is probably going to be some kind of pipe or channel or ditch or swale that the water is going to flow to. So we just considered a 24-inch pipe at a 0.5% slope, and for a ditch, we considered a 3-foot wide ditch with 3-to-1 side slopes. And so these are meant to be kind of like, you know, minimums. Now, obviously, we can go to a 12-inch pipe, see what that looks like. But it felt like that's going to be kind of towards the bottom of the infrastructure that you're going to see. Most ditches aren't going to be 3 and, you know, that tight. They're going to be a little bit wider. You're going to have more space. So by using these kind of standardized, you know, minimums, if you will, then we can conclude that this is going to work for, you know, 90 to 95% of the county areas, let's say. But that was another reason why then we threw in the idea of having a professional engineer being able to analyze that downstream infrastructure, just in case it does operate a little bit differently. And I'll show that to you guys. So by running those scenarios, what we found was that for that type of pipe, a difference of about 1.1 cubic feet per second led to an increase of 0.1 feet. And for the swale, it was about 2.25 cubic feet per second. So essentially, now when you run the two scenarios, it's an easy, is that flow rate increase higher or lower than that number? If it's lower, then you would get the exemption with the idea that we know, you know, it wouldn't increase more than a tenth. If it's higher, you wouldn't get the exemption. You would either have to provide detention, or you're dealing with, again, some kind of infrastructure that doesn't fit the 24-inch scenario. Maybe the engineer needs to analyze it and show that you're not increasing it by more than that inch in that downstream pipe or swale or whatever it is. So some of that is we've already looked at, but you know, some things to think about would be, you know, we can have a tier method. For example, in flood hazard areas, it can be 1/10 of a foot. Municipalities, this is where, you know, with your pipe networks, I don't know if that 1/10 of a foot or inch is reasonable. In less urbanized areas, you know, we can have it higher, let's say. So there are ways to be accommodating and understanding that someone developing in a wide open area, you know, might be able to have a higher increase and not expect flood issues. Should we use different metrics, different size pipe, different swale? So just some things to kind of think about from that perspective. So
relate this to field tile out in the country. Your mains, I mean, you know what all your mains are and everything when you're looking at one of these projects?
probably not. So the thing with drain tile is if there is drainage that is relying on that, then we, you know, it's, again, I gotta look at the definition of channel here. It doesn't have that necessarily, so this would not be incorporating a drain tile type reliance. But that's where each scenario can be different. I don't know, and the drain tiles can be different, the reliability on those drain tiles is different. So that's why we added the component that if you can't go through this simplified method of doing the calculations and just using, the swales, ditches, things like that, that you do have the engineer option that can come in and say, well, we have drain tile, we surveyed it, it's still in good condition, it's this size, here's the flow that's gonna go through it, we don't have a 10th of an increase. That's why we threw that in there. This isn't gonna catch every situation, but it does still give the applicant an ability to avoid detention and alleviates the pressure from us trying to anticipate every single situation that might not fit this criteria. So that was the difficulty, and that's why we ultimately decided to add that engineer's component there. Because that's a lot of, investigation, Jim, like we might not know what the drain tile looks like, the size, all of that information. So in order for us to have confidence in it, it would have to be analyzed for that situation.
So when we're doing all these solar farms and everything, I know you had an example in here of the solar farm later on. When we're doing these solar farms and all that, and most of them are talking about drain tiles, you're gonna require detention on all of them? If the drain tiles really don't have effect?
Well, the detention is, so I'll talk specifically about detention and how we would want to handle it. With the solar farms, we're trying to avoid detention because the idea is that these potentially would go back to farming. If you put in a detention basin and all of this infrastructure, I don't see how you can go back to.
Well, I understand that. So the drain tile, though, you don't have any,
So
maybe I understood this wrong.
we make them replace the drain tiles in those situations. They have to maintain the drain tiles. There's no scenario where you can remove the drain tile unless specifically the applicant wants to do that, they want to break up the drain tile. They still have to provide us an analysis that wherever they're cutting it off, the water isn't going to back up and cause issues upstream. It's still passing through the property, but instead of the drain tile, they want to create more of like a wetland opportunity and meandering stream. Maybe it's for restoration, whatever it is. That's the type of analysis that we can't really do with this simplified idea. The simplified idea is to help, 85, 90% of those applicants that have more clear-cut situations than this. But it still gives an avenue, we felt that if you're gonna be hiring an engineer, whether it's detention or do this analysis, at least you're saving money on having to do detention and tear up your land.
Okay.
It's kind of a compromise, if you will, but we just don't know, because there's too many unique situations you would have to look at. I don't see a way that we would be able to capture all of those cleanly with just analyzing 2 or 3 items like this.
Right off the bat, they consider panels as pervious. They do not consider them as impervious.
We do if they're proposing natives underneath the panels. No, that's not codified in the SMO. That's something that we're going to look to do. So we're going to look to have some solar specific components in the ordinance. I've just been trying to get over this hump of this detention component so that would be the next step. But we do consider that if they're putting in the natives and using our performance standards, and we want to implement other site prep work pre-hand that currently we can't require, to increase the success and likelihood that you're not seeing, or that at least you're seeing less weeds in years 1 and 2.
So perhaps I'm in the weeds here a little bit, but I'm looking at the solar issue since the new laws, basically municipalities got drug into this too now. But the idea that they could put battery storage out there now, any place, and when they have a fire on these things, you basically can't put them out.
Right.
And then if it's gonna sit there and burn or whatever, and contamination. My question is, how do we handle that in a drainage situation? If you got water running through, and now all of a sudden you got contamination, now you've contaminated all the way down to the streams and everything else. So how are we gonna handle that possibly in this ordinance? Can we handle that somehow?
Yeah, that's actually conversations we started to have internally. We're trying to understand those battery systems a little bit clearer. I think they've made some improvements on their end, as I understand it. It's still new.
I don't
so-
trust their improvements. I mean, flat out,
Right,
when
but,
a
so,
nuclear burn down is gonna keep going.
right,
And so I'd rather us be ahead of the game and put total restriction on that as much as possible.
we've discussed if that happens, what it would look like, what the emergency situation would look like. So we've talked about trying to come up with ways to have containment systems, liners, ways that can be captured. So, you know, if you're talking about true containment, because it's gonna rain, I don't know how you do that other than providing some kind of canopy. That way, you know, at the time, you know, everything does go down, but it's gonna be captured within the containment system with a canopy. The rain would not go into the containment system, but it's still brand new, but we are thinking about those things, and trying to come up with ways to deal with those problems. And you're right, they do just allow them to burn. And it sounds like the newer technology, because of issues in the past now, they bring them in as kind of individual units and they kind of burn internally, apparently. Is there still risk for that escaping and creating issues? Yeah, there is. But I think we're still trying to understand some of how they build it, I guess, in a way. I mean, the fire districts, you know, want to understand that just as much as we do. So from an emergency response perspective, we don't know, we don't think they're going to be trying to put you know, water on it or any kind of chemicals to put it out. We understand you can't really do that.
You know, maybe let you finish this, but I do want us to come back to that before we close out here today, because I want to talk about these battery things because a lot of these solar farms are in wetlands with a creek running through the middle of them and everything. I mean, especially some of those over by Union that we approved. There's water in the creek on the drought at times, you know, that's going right 20 feet away from the solar panels. So I really have an issue that we have to fix that somehow.
But are we even allowed to put those requirements in, like,
I
the
think we
CUP?
should be able to.
Yeah.
I don't know about the CUP, but I mean, from a stormwater perspective, if we wanted to have buffers and things like that, we definitely could. I do want to be mindful, though, we would have limitations in the SMO with that stuff because of the extension into municipalities. We can't get into, you know, zoning type, you know, setback requirements, because then we're telling the municipalities how to run their, you know, districts, whatever it is. So it's.
So I understand.
Those are the initial
I want to let you finish
conversations,
this
you know,
though,
so-
and then we'll go back to that, because I think this is a discussion for a future then, at this point.
Absolutely.
But I was wondering about our tiles here first of contamination from those batteries, but let's let you move on here on
I
that.
don't know if there's
One quick
Oh, wait.
question / comment. You know, some of these, it's like any discipline on the municipality side. Some of what makes a development cost prohibitive is what we make everybody do for the stormwater development, because you're developing the land. Where I've got a concern is if the regulations are less for a solar farm because there's the grass area underneath or canopy, whatever you want to call that. It's making these easier for people to pop up because the infrastructure cost to make the site development work is less. Is there a way, I'm just thinking out loud here, and I might be crazy, that if you're going to develop a solar farm, it's the same as developing houses, where you need your own on-site detention that's there, I'm just trying to think of another way where we can maybe deter some of these from, instead of doing an actual development, saying, oh, I can make more money by putting a solar farm there. Almost killing two birds with one stone, just to make sure that the regulations for taking care of us in the future are taken care of, but also not just letting it go into the tiles, if that makes any sense.
I guess everyone's
I would-
looking at
I
me.
would say the state regulations would rule, and then you can't put more regulations on than what the state requirements are, so I think we find a hard time doing that.
But the state regulation still, the stormwater is part of that regulation. And we're not changing it, but it does throw that LaSalle factor in play in a lot of these instances.
I think you did.
So it has to be defined in stormwater that you can't put a battery system where it's gonna be overrun by a flood, a 100-year flood, and water doesn't like batteries, right? Batteries don't like water, I should say. And that's what causes them to start on fire a lot of times.
I was just gonna add to that, because I think part of the reason this came up in the first place is I think there's opportunities for using, because the site permitting is just at that point, then they've gotta meet everything else. But we can't make those ordinances so ridiculously restrictive. That's
Right.
part of the reason why they did this in the first place, was because places were making their own ordinances so restrictive that they were basically eliminating solar altogether. So while we were doing it right from the beginning, because others weren't, they implemented this, they put this in. So there are opportunities, but I'm just saying we just got to be careful.
Right, and our ordinances have to be practical.
Practical, right, exactly.
I agree with you on that, practical of, hey, is this thing gotta be on top of a pyramid, for crying out loud, like that one in Union? That thing's gotta be 10 foot up from what the surface is, because that place has got water on it every 2 years where we put that solar farm. There's 4 or 5 feet of water out there.
They do have to elevate, that's the current requirement. We could certainly throw on other restrictions for those type of facilities, batteries. There's obviously life safety risks associated with
And peak does
electricity
burn.
and water, so.
So, go on, Carl.
And help me understand, we can throw a solar farm and we don't have to worry about having detention, retention, because it's just sitting out there. But a battery farm, you're gonna have to have containers which is taking up surface that you have to show where that water's, how does that work?
Well, we do review the solar farms for their impervious surfaces, and that's part of, we feel that if they are going to implement the native vegetation underneath, you won't see issues in terms of flooding. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't have a solar farm come in, and depending on the grading changes and some of those factors that you would see some type of problem, but we do look at it on a case-by-case basis. The majority of the time, that's been our stance, is if you implement the natives underneath.
Well, I got it with the solar, you're
Right,
really
so-
not taking up surface land.
With-
But throw a battery where you're putting a concrete foundation.
So now you might need detention for that area, yeah. And it just depends how large, right? It's no different than if you want to call it an ag building, a parking lot, a battery storage area, it's still concrete, asphalt, hard surface. It doesn't matter from a stormwater perspective. So it just depends how large, how big. One of our big priorities is the usage, the groundwater usage of water. So we don't want that to be lost. How much these things, depending on how they're designed, the amount of water usage that they potentially will need can affect the local aquifer that they would be tapping into. Fire suppression is another big component, which is probably going to push a lot of these into the municipalities, because you're just not going to get, unless you do a high capacity well, you're probably not going to get the pressure that you need. But again, this is just initial information that we're still trying to figure out and get to the bottom of. And it's difficult because a lot of these developers are not really giving that information out. So for example, how much water usage these battery storage facilities use. We just don't know because currently the best estimates are on a life cycle. And a part of that is the water that's also used to create this, which might be done somewhere else. And so we just don't really have a good idea of, you know, some of these parameters and having a good understanding of it to address some of these concerns. But we certainly are aware of them and trying to talk to the right people and you know, figure it out, and then, you know, decide, is it a UDO, is it a stormwater, is it a combination?
Well, and I think our goal has to be, we gotta let you finish this, but our goal has to be is when we get to that, then, because we're pretty much talked this out now, but our goal has to be protect the people, the municipalities, and the county from potential litigation if they have an objection to something that is a very legitimate objection. We have to, through stormwater on that side of the LaSalle factor, we have to have the best program for a solar farm. You know, that protects everybody and yet works with the state statute. So I think that's our goal, the thoughts that we have to put forward. And that is gonna be part of this committee later on, our commission.
Yes.
So
I couldn't agree with you more. We've also taken steps as zoning starts to get in the information for their CUPs. Scott and I are providing comments even before it gets to anyone, just our initial thoughts on some of those. And we have on 2 so far made comments where they've come back and made revisions based on our commentary that, you know, your access road probably shouldn't go. Or it's you know, it's flooding very badly there, you can see that. And like, oh, okay, that's a good point. So we are trying to be proactive at the same time and just trying to give them feedback, just to work with these folks as well, to just have good relationships. But at the end of the day, I agree, we need to have it figured out, or as best that we can with the information available.
right. Okay. Go on, I'm sorry that I got off on this tangent, but
Well,
I think this, what you're going over has to do with that, so.
It will, so I forget where I left off, but I think I was gonna jump into the example here. So how do we deploy this? And again, simplified method is just kind of a working term here. But I put together this example. So the vision here is I'm working with GIS, who's working with their contractor to hopefully have an online tool where a lot of the information that is required to run these calculations, we can kind of point and click, get the information, and then be able to input it either through an interactive kind of design element where the person will get a bunch of questions depending on how they respond. It automatically populates these fields. Or something into like a spreadsheet where we'll have it highlighted, like, hey, you got your area using our tool, put it over here, and so then that way it doesn't necessarily need to be an engineer, and this can be a tool too for anyone to kind of figure out, are they trending towards detention or are they trending towards an exemption? So I pulled a just random property here. It was about a little less than about 5.5 acres. And I just said, I'm gonna do an acre here and they're gonna just do gravel or pave it for parking or whatever they wanna use. So the idea would be then the person would be able to find their property and kind of click or make a little square like this to indicate this is where I'm gonna put my development area. So then what would happen is, using the contour information, and King County has already developed some of this, so that's why I'm confident we can kind of duplicate it. But then the program will say, okay, here is your tributary area. So it will spit that out. So I apologize here, it's negative because depending on the direction you go, it will do a negative number. So still a little bit of kinks here for GIS to work out in our viewer. But anyway, so that's about 2 acres. So that's the first component that you would really need to start with this. The second is something called the curve number. So for those of you not familiar, that is just trying to describe the type of land cover. So to give you an idea, those values range from 0 to 100. 100 meaning that all of the rainfall from that surface will basically flow off. So the example that I gave is for concrete and asphalt, we use a curve number of 98, just simply because not all of it runs off after a rain event. I'm sure you can see that there's still some water kind of caught in the little nooks and crannies of the pavement. For example, if you do a curve number of 50, that would mean about half of the rainfall would either be infiltrated, evaporated, taken up by vegetation. So that's what the curve number is intended to do. It's supposed to represent how that ground is going to function. All of this stems from a methodology called TR55. It's basically widely accepted at this point, so we're not reinventing the wheel on this process. So for the current example, we've got about 2.03 acres in our tributary area. I went with a curve number of 74, which represents open space for lawns, parks, golf courses with grass cover more than 5% in the area. Any questions on curve number and this component?
Where are you getting the 74?
Yeah,
Is it just like a
it's a table, yeah. So the TR55, what they did was they created a table just through analysis and experimentation.
So is this because it's gravel? Is this 74 because it's gravel?
No, so I'm using basically open space indicating it's grass. Now, I don't know, like I'm using an aerial, I just assumed it's grass here. It could be something a little bit different.
Oh, you mean around it, around where the?
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
What is the
Thank you.
ground, what is the ground like?
Around it.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So, yeah.
Is the thought that the program would calculate that for the person using the simplified method with the curve number, or you're gonna be asking them to calculate that?
No, it's with the idea that would be an input, and then we would have it automated where it would spit out the calculations, here's the flow. But that would be like a question that we can pose. What is the ground condition like currently? Is it grass? Is it agricultural? Is it a pavement? So depending on how they answer, that's where they're not going to a large list of tables to try to figure out which curve number. Depending on how they answer, we would all that information would get inputted. So it's kind of meant to be, hey user, you've got to give us some information, and then it's supposed to be set up to where it can run the information. I indicated I would give you a copy of that table. I think I forgot to do that, but I can pull that up to show you guys, what it looks like. I tried to develop this section in mind that I'm talking more to my non-engineers in the room to kind of simplify it. But yeah, I can pull up tables, charts, and kind of that would be more for my TAC, if you will. But so they developed a table that shows that information. So then the last remaining item that we would need is something called the time of concentration. That basically just looks at that tributary area that we had defined. It's within the property area, so you're taking the most upstream point, the most downstream point, and you're saying that this is going to be the longest flow path for rain falling in here to kind of get to this low area. That can also, the idea is that would be calculated by the person clicking within that system. The flow path would be defined, so it will give you a distance, and then it would be able to pick up those contour elevations and provide a slope. So at that point, again, with minimal information, is it paved, unpaved, just some questions, we can develop a velocity, if you will, that will give us that time of concentration. So once you have that, This is just to give you guys an idea here for the worksheet that's used. So like I said, all of this information as an engineer, we can read the charts. So the idea is that we would be asking a person like this Manning's roughness coefficient is based on the ground cover. Is it bare earth? Is it concrete? Is it asphalt? That's a question we can ask the person, and then depending on how they answer, it automatically populates. So they're not having to worry about finding it on the chart or anything like that. So we would go through the effort to minimize the work that someone would need to do. But this is what it looks like. You basically, enter in all this information. You're working off of velocity, right? If you have the velocity and you know the distance, you can get the time it takes for that to go from point A to point B. So here I'm just indicating that I took my 2.03, I took out 1 acre, I put that curve number of 98 for the proposed condition. Basically that I have about 1.03 at the 74, so that gives me a new composite in that tributary area. So we have all the information we need, essentially, and so I just created a printout of what it would look like. Now, depending on working with GIS, we would love to put this into kind of an interactive user. If not, we would have a spreadsheet. We already have an example spreadsheet from NRCS, but again, it would have everything in there, so then you're just entering some of these numbers that you're pulling from our viewer. But so basically what I did was I ran all of the existing flow events, all of the proposed flow events. I gave here just to kind of give you guys a flavor of the amount of volume that would be produced. Here I tried to give some standard to visualize it from a 12-foot diameter pool, roughly 5.5 feet or whatever it is. So you guys can kind of see the volume difference. So in the shorter rain events, we're gonna see higher peaks here. They peak around the 30 in the 1 hour, as I had mentioned to all of you. You can see the flow difference, right? And then just the volume difference. And again, the reason why a lot of the calculations go to the 24-hour is because of that volume, that amount of volume that you're dealing with, but why we don't go to 240, even though it's a big number. You can kind of see that the difference between the 24-hour and the 240, that volume isn't that high, whereas if you look at it here, it's a much greater difference. So just to give you guys a little bit idea of why maybe, and I don't really know, when they first set the regulations for 24-hour, 100-year, I'd have to think these were some of the things that they were thinking about. So I just wanted to show you guys, give you guys a full picture of what you're looking at when we're talking about a specific rain event. So what I did then was I added that 24-inch pipe like I had discussed. And so what we're seeing here, this is real life event. So you're seeing here again that flow difference is pretty high, it's at 6. Here's what the results show, that in existing condition, you're at about 2.2 feet. And again, this would exceed the pipe, so I just let the program run the scenario. Just for purposes, it assumes basically a column above it. But you can see the difference of what you would roughly expect. You're going to get about a 6-inch increase here. If you don't have the tension, it just drains to a pipe. Here's what it would look like in a swale. So this kind of real life scenario was what was used to kind of backtrack and lower this flow here. If I go back real quick, I apologize. To get to this 1.1 and 2.25. So the idea is now we have some actual information. It's got a methodology applied to it. It has a method, and that's what we're starting to see. And so when I pose these questions to you, this is where we can make a determination of should we keep the 0.1 increase? Should we increase it? Should we use it? Should I use, do you guys want to see different, pipe, a different swale? What is that going to look like? So that pipe and that swale was kind of working with the TAC and really DOT to just kind of indicate like, I asked Ernest like, what would be like a typical swale or kind of worst case? Well, what's the smallest pipe? And so we kind of settled on a 24-inch and a 3-foot wide swale with 3 to 1 would kind of be those, lower end parameters. So so when you run through this method, if you get that increase, and so in this method, what would happen is the system would automatically spit out and say, hey, you're above the 1.1, therefore you need detention. You can't use the exemption. So what I wanted to do though was show you guys a different example of why I added the engineers component. So I took another site, roughly 77 acres of tributary area here. There is a swale that runs through here. It's pretty large. You look at different years, I think it has historical. But what I wanted to show is it's a bigger area. I again just threw in, I'm going to do 1 acre of whatever, land, impervious parking, etc. So I did the same scenario. I've got my tributary area here. I added in the 1 acre of impervious. I know the ground condition in this case is going to be more row crop, so I used a curve number for that. I ran that longest flow path again through the site is something like this. And and again, I'm not spending a lot of time. Is it this? Is it more here? It's probably very minor. Just trying to get the data in. So again, same exact process. What we're seeing here though is that don't really have a real change from existing to proposed. And that was the idea that we discussed previously. If you have a large piece of land, you drop a small chunk of impervious, what's really going to be the difference that you're going to see? So in this case, this person that wants to do the 1 acre would go through that method. It would, hone in this case, the 1 hour, and it would say, oh, you're actually at 0, you're less than the 1.1, or in this case, it's a swale, 2.25, you're exempt from detention. So what I wanted to highlight though was I went to the 10% here, and unfortunately I didn't give you the flows. So this would be approximately 7 acres of new impervious. The difference in the proposed and existing flow at that peak becomes about 10 CFS. So in the simplified method, what it's going to show is, oh, you're sorry, we can't exempt you because you're higher than the 2.25 requirement. But if you were to get an engineer and actually model that giant swale, you can see the increase in the flow is only 0.2 in that swale. So the engineer would be able to show through analysis that you're not increasing it more than 1/10. Therefore, we can still exempt you. And that was, this is the type of situation where you would need to do it on a case by case. And that's why we have that idea in there of using the engineer. And this doesn't have to be, a swale, it can be anything, but it still gives them an ability to model those downstream conditions more accurately instead of using our generic 3-foot wide swale, 24-inch pipe. So it's just to show that if they were to try our simplified method, they would show, roughly 10 more CFS in that higher condition. They would not be exempt. If they hire the engineer, then they can demonstrate that they're actually fine. So that is the full concept behind the exemption. And we're hoping that, like I said, working with GIS, that a lot of this is going to be automated. There's still some kinks to work out. For example, if you're doing 1 acre of impervious, depending on where you're putting your project, is it going to be through the flow path? The time of concentration could vary a little bit. So there are some things we're aware of that we're going to potentially bake in to how the calcs are handled so that you're always considering a conservative approach or a worst case scenario. So the one thing that can be different in the existing versus proposed is in the proposed, you can lower that time of concentration because now you're paving grass areas or, you know, agricultural areas, or you're doing grading changes. So if I go back to the idea of using the simplified method, some of the language that we put in there, that was the direct result of keeping drainage patterns, and making sure you're flowing to a known channel area as part of that simplified method. Otherwise, hey, have your engineer provide us a specific analysis that's unique to that site. So that's the two examples, just showing how they both kind of fit together, where if someone was to use the simplified method, they still can. And this is something that if people are struggling, we can make available through appointments, much like pre-applications. We can sit down with folks, you know, make sure that they're doing it right. You know, you guys can decide, do we charge a fee for that? Is that, you know, I don't know how many of those we would get that might impact review times and permits, but is it worth it? Do we make it available, you know, twice a month on between this time slot that people can sign up for? So there's a lot of ability here to customize this and make it user-friendly and provide a lot of value to people. And part of the idea behind this also was the concern from some of the engineering community or the designers, developers that, well, now I don't know that I'm going to be able to provide a quick service to determine if someone wants to hire me, how much attention they're going to need. Well, if we have this tool available, it's not going to take long to do that. So we're trying to accommodate everybody through the use of this. So I do want to stop here before I move on to the next section and just collect thoughts, ideas, concerns, keep going with it, pause on it.
One quick question. If the applicant is using this tool, how does that tool take into account previous new impervious area that's been added a little bit prior? Like, you know, since the ordinance was adopted, because I've always viewed it as, you know, it's 10% since we adopted the ordinance.
Sure.
And so like, you know, for instance, like 3 years ago, they added 45 or, you know, a quarter acre, and now they're adding 3/10 of an acre. Oh, they've exceeded that half an acre. You know what I'm saying? How does that get taken into account?
So that is one of the kind of the things that I mentioned, and we could, you know, because we have access to aerials, we can have kind of a qualifying question. Since 2005, has the ground cover changed in any way, right? And so those are the type of things we'd have, you know, those very specific details, I try to avoid getting too much into those before I've kind of gotten approval that I can kind of keep going.
But it will, I guess.
But yes, that is one thing that we are mindful of, that, hey, we don't want to, you know, someone comes in and, you know, well, our existing condition was like this, and, you know, they added 10,000 square feet at that time, so they didn't need detention. Now they're coming in and they're triggering detention, and they're trying to use that. I think because they're using a permit, that's going to be caught in the review process too. So if they try to kind of, you know, go under the radar of capturing their existing conditions, the enforcement officer is going to have that ability. Something that's not in here also that needs to be written in is there's probably going to be scenarios, especially in the municipalities, where, you know, I don't care what this says, this area floods. So you're going to need, so that would give the enforcement officer an opportunity, such as yourself, to say, no, you're going to need to do detention and you're going to need to control your release rates because I know it floods. So this is not going to be applicable. So we do want to give that freedom to the municipalities, especially because in those areas, urban flooding, pluvial flooding is the #1 issue, and that's related to infrastructure that was, you know, built 50, 60 years ago, not meant to handle the increased rainfall intensities. So that is something that still needs to go in here, but this is just kind of the main concept down on paper, very rough draft, to just give you guys an idea. how it's gonna function, some scenarios, some examples, and then how we would, the idea of rolling it out. And I would love to make it interactive to where someone is clicking and answering components as opposed to having to do a spreadsheet. Maybe we'll get there, it's just gonna take some time. But, you know, some of this is gonna depend on how much GIS can come back and be able to say, yeah, someone can click and we can give them an area and give them a flow path, because I think those are critical. Otherwise, you know, you're gonna need either staff's help or an engineer to make sure that it's accurate. Otherwise, the person might try to use it, and if they don't use it correctly, now they're in the mindset like, well, I used your tool, that's why I didn't put detention in. So we do want to avoid that scenario where we're putting something out where someone can misuse it incorrectly. So that's on the top of our minds as well.
Larry?
I like the concept. Anytime you can put some methodology to it, where you can get people moving forward with their projects. But you know, personally, I don't have the technical expertise to tell you whether that should be 0.1 feet or 2.2 feet. So the concept's good. I don't have the technical expertise to advise you on any of that kind of stuff.
No, I certainly appreciate that. Obviously, I'll lean on TAC more on that question, but obviously, you know, if there's any input or thoughts, I want to give everybody an opportunity to do that. So we'll discuss that in TAC. They haven't seen this language yet. We've kind of talked about it. One of the big criteria is I was just focusing on the 24-hour storm event when I was running through this initially. So that was part of the feedback from them as well. No, we should be doing all of these. And I think that was somebody previously indicated that we should have an emphasis on those lower duration, higher intensity storms because they are more frequent. So I agree, and so that's what was born out of those discussions, Larry, to your point. That's why I have those folks to pick at those details and, you know, focus in on those things. So hopefully when I come back, you know, if it still remains at 0.1, I'll be able to give you that feedback on how discussions went, or if we feel we can, you know, kind of have a range depending on the different scenarios, then I will present that info to all of you. If there's nothing else, I will continue to the next portion. So let me go back up to the language. I apologize for making you guys flip through back and forth in the packet. So if you need me to slow down, I will. So you've gone through the process essentially to determine if you're going to be exempt from detention or not, and it turns out you're going to need detention. So this section, the TAC has had exposure to. The language is still rough though. We're still working through, you know, I ran a lot of scenarios, so that's kind of the tail end of a lot of those examples. Why there's a lot more, you know, calculations and things like that, and if I lost anyone, I apologize. I had it already, you know, there. So I'm gonna run through some of that so you guys can understand it. But what we're really looking to do with the release rate, or let me give you guys an idea of how it currently works. How it currently works is if someone's doing a development, they have to figure out their development area, and then their allowable release from that area was based on this 0.15 cubic feet per second per acre. So if you're doing 2 acres, you multiply it by this number, that's how much water you can allow to flow out of your detention basin. So that's how it was currently written. It's these static numbers that were born 40, 50 years ago when a lot of this was still combined sewer areas, and it just kind of stayed with it for ease of regulations. And again, I don't have the complete history. This is kind of what some of the TAC members that have been around for some time kind of indicated is that's where these numbers came from. So the difference here, or the considerations we made, and solar farms factored into this a little bit because you're getting these, or even just, ag developments or that 77 acre, Tracy, I've been out to your property. You guys have a long stretch of driveway to a building that's strategically located for things that you need, located on a large piece of land. So at the point that you're gonna need detention, all of a sudden, all of that impervious area and, development area triggers the need for that detention. So what we're looking to focus on is more the impervious area, not so much the development area, because if the main change that we talked about, if your area is already vegetated, but you're doing some rework because you gotta disturb the area because of other improvements, footings, et cetera, but you're gonna put it back to grass. You're gonna have some compaction in that, but in terms of ground cover type, you're not really making any change. So you are losing a little bit of storage volume in that void space from that compaction. But if you vegetate it, and if you use natives especially, with the freeze thaw over time, with the root system, you're probably gonna get that void space back. So trying to require detention on areas that don't seem to be the big impact as to why we get increases in flow didn't seem appropriate, and we wanted to come in and focus on just the areas that you're making impervious or areas that you're clearing. It was a wooded area providing benefit. If you go from a wooded area to grass, you're gonna lose some of that storage, obviously, with the trees, the canopies, all of that stuff. So that's what we really thought the allowable release rates should be focused on. And from that perspective, instead of saying you're allowed to release this much, we're saying you need to reduce the flow from those surfaces, from your impervious surfaces or the areas you've cleared. And this ties again to the simplified method because you're looking at your existing conditions. The way it's currently drawn up, you're not looking at your existing conditions at all. You could be taking tributary areas that didn't flow to this location, now they flow to that location, the existing ground cover, we don't take into account you're removing a highly functioning wooded area, and so none of that is being factored in. In this scenario it is, and what we're saying is, you need to figure out what those surfaces are, and right now we're looking, for a placeholder, we're saying you need to have a reduction of about 0.85 cubic feet per second on those impervious areas and about 0.3 on those areas that you've cleared. Identifying that if you put in those impervious area, you're going to be increasing the flow, so obviously it makes sense to have a reduction to decrease the flow off of those areas. So that's really how, and this is a really big change. Nobody's really analyzing it like this. But to us, it makes sense because it goes back to the idea of analyzing existing versus proposed conditions, using that curve number. So this reduction here, if you guys remember the curve number 0 to 100, this would basically indicate or kind of be a symmetrical to a curve number of around 40 or so. So what we're saying is that we want your impervious area to operate at a curve number of roughly 40, which if you remember for that other one, the existing curve number I used for the grass area was 74. So we are requiring a reduction there to make sure that, again, we're not creating flooding issues. So that's the concept behind this. The reason we feel that this works well, I'll jump into some of the, and there is this section here. I'll come back to this because I think it'll demonstrate it through the example more clearly. So I'm going to go to this example on page, if you want to flip to your packet. Let me get there, I apologize. 18, page 18 in your packets at the bottom. So this was a project in Lakethorn. So I did not make up any of the numbers. I just took it straight from the proposed design. I just regurgitated everything for your viewing pleasure. What we have here is the existing conditions. I show 3 different tributary areas. So there's number 3 that goes to the right-of-way. There's number 2 here, which is a depressional that goes directly to the east here. And then there's number 1 that outlets out here to the southeast corner of the site. So I'm just giving you, again, as we mentioned, curve number, time of concentration, that's what the TC is, and the different areas. These are the different flows. So the reason area 2 is 0 is because when you run the analysis, it stores the full volume for the 100-year, 24-hour storm within that depression. So in current conditions, if we go to their proposed or under proposed conditions with the current stormwater ordinance requirements, basically this is what they're proposing. They're still going to have a little bit flow out to the right-of-way in what I've identified as tributary area 2. And then number 1, basically that middle area in here is 3.65. They are going to redo the grading in here. Everything is going to flow down to this area where they were proposing detention. And that's going to be the common case with a lot of development. You're going to try to regrade and use gravity to put one detention location so that you can maximize your usable space. Obviously makes sense from an economical perspective. So that's what we're seeing in this condition. And so again, I'm just giving the raw numbers here for you guys. You don't have to focus on anything. What I do want you to pay attention to is that their proposed impervious in this new tributary area 1 is about 5.45 acres, okay? So if we were to use our new method, we would be saying that you need to provide a reduction of flow on that 5.45 acres. And that reduction, when you do the multiplication, would be 4.63. So what we're saying is you need to reduce the existing flow by 4.63 CFS. And the difference between the existing, which is 3.03, and the proposed, which is 4.63, becomes negative. The significance of that is due to the idea that they've taken this middle tributary area that did not flow here and now dumped it into here. This was a part of the ordinance that we had discussed previously for that adequate downstream component that we've had an issue with. This methodology would directly address that issue because now basically you're at a negative, indicating that you're changing your tributary areas in a way that is not going to meet requirements. In this type of situation, I'm going to go back real quick. You guys don't have to. I'm just going to pull up on the screen here. If you look, that's what this is meant to describe. So if you get to 0 or below, and it might not be 0, maybe it's a 0.25 CFS or a half CFS, something that's going to be very small. What we're saying is you need to go back, take a look at your design, and try to maintain your existing drainage patterns better, as much as practicable. If you can't do that, we want you to try to use infiltration, with the idea that if it's infiltrating in the ground, it's not leaving the site. If that's not feasible, we're going to make you use the existing 2-year peak flow rate as your discharge. So this would be, in any situation, this flow rate would be very small, essentially. So that's the hierarchy. Yes.
I apologize.
No apologies.
I'm confused. You have the existing conditions, which are 3 areas.
Correct.
You're proposing to make that 2 areas now.
Yes.
In the proposed conditions, you're showing a proposed flow rate of 6.97 CFS.
Correct.
So wouldn't the reduction be against that?
No, the reason I'm showing that is because really what you want to do in the process is if you want to see if it works, you want to understand what your proposed flow rate is, and then take a look and compare, okay, the 6.97, you know, I basically, let me show you this tributary area, because this is going to make more sense because they're not changing the flow paths. So in the smaller one, my proposed flow out of the smaller one is 0.55, right? They're proposing 0.11 of impervious. So the reduction on the 0.11 proposed would be 0.09. So their existing flow is 0.73, you remove the 0.09, their allowable is 0.62. So they're currently at 0.55, so they would be fine in that situation. So the reason I'm showing the 6.97 is one, to just show that this flow rate is far above zero, so they need to reduce that down to what the allowable is. And the reduction would be the amount of detention that's required. I lost everyone I know.
I get the concept.
I understand the concept of reducing flow.
Yeah.
But if they're saying I'm gonna combine those two areas, and that's now area one,
Correct.
and if I do that, my flow is 6.97.
Right, but the reduction is going to be based on existing conditions, not proposed conditions.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
okay.
So that's the big key is we're looking at those existing conditions and we're factoring them into detention, whereas current regulations, we don't do that. Whatever the existing conditions might be like, you might be wiping out an area that's acting as a great flood control, doesn't get factored in. We're just basically saying the detention you provide is going to basically take its place and act in the same way, but that might be true if you maintain it, you know, and we just show as a little preview as I go into the watershed planning in the Kishwaukee River watershed. Currently we have about 343 existing detention basins. They're not, definitely not all maintained and working like they're supposed to. The other problem is that these detention basins are, you know, based on, they're built 30, 40, 50 years ago, so they might not also be functioning. Whereas the current vegetation, if you're trying to emphasize, trying to maintain that and keep the green infrastructure, that's gonna keep up, that's gonna keep performing, right? There's very little maintenance required. Maybe you gotta mow it, you know, whatever it is compared to some of the other capabilities. But that's the big change is our reductions are based off existing conditions so that in no way when you move to the proposed, you're ever gonna have a scenario where your proposed flow might be higher than what you had in existing. Whereas with the current codes, and if I jump to my solar farm, the only reason I threw this in here, and I knew I was playing a dangerous game with solar and I was bringing up a lot of stuff, was just to demonstrate the 3 different tributary areas, right? So there's a creek on the bottom here, and I think it's Franklinville Creek. But in this scenario, sure, you have this tributary area that's gonna flow to the creek and this tributary area that's flow to the creek. And let's just say, you know, it wasn't a creek. This area here flows a different way. Well, like in the previous example, the engineer is gonna put a detention basin in the lowest point, and then this area is now gonna flow to here. And so you could have a situation where if you're using the current standards, and you just say, well, you're allowed to release at 0.15, you're introducing 20 acres more in this area that you can no longer presume that the proposed conditions are gonna be better, or it's gonna be lower in the existing conditions. And that was kind of the big driver to us. And so when you look back to the simplified method, we're proposing existing versus proposed, or we're comparing existing versus proposed, our release rate, same methodology, same idea, it just seems to kind of work together. And this will help directly address that concern of the adequate downstream capacity, because we come in and everything's based on the existing conditions, your reduction is based off of that. So if you're always reducing the existing condition, and to Chris, to your point, making sure we capture that existing condition appropriately on just development over time for when detention is triggered, then you know, that's the idea behind it. And you know, whether or not we want the 0.85 reduction, bump it up, you know, bring it down, that's kind of what the TAC is working on. But that's the general focus. And so I did in here, again, provide you guys with all of that same data and same information. And I tried to do a little table for you guys showing the existing flows, the required reduction. So this is what the allowable would be. And then I pulled these flows off of their information. So the idea with the solar on why we wouldn't require detention, so this was a solar due to just the length of this gravel drive, right? But let's say it's not a solar. You know, Tracy, let's say it's you know, your site. You guys have something similar, or it's another ag field or whatever it is. You know, maybe it's municipal property. You know, sheriff, whatever. You're triggering detention off of that because it's about 3 acres or just shy of that, I want to say. And so, if you're going to do detention, number one, it's really hard to capture all of this. If you're doing detention, then it kind of goes against the idea that you want this going back to ag over time, right, that we talked about. And these guys are coming in and proposing native vegetation, and we're requiring they do the standards. And I understand that currently a lot of our soil farms have weeds. We've taken notice too. So that's part of the next rewrite, is we think that there's some things we can implement to help with that process. Now, is it gonna be smooth? No, because it depends on the type of season. If we're heavy in drought, everybody's gonna have a hard time establishing this and fighting weeds in general. But that's the idea behind this. So this is just demonstrating if we were to use the new standards, they would be showing that they would be meeting those flow rate reductions for what they're proposing. And I just threw in the grading just to show you guys that I would be confident, because this is about 930 up here. So it would be very easy for them to put one detention here with 20 feet of fall. That's what they would do to make all, imagine now this is a commercial development. They're gonna maximize a subdivision. They're gonna maximize every inch, pull out as many houses as they can, or commercial property. So they're gonna do one detention down here. So there's no doubt in my mind that top 20 acres is gonna end up coming. Now in this case, sure, everything flows to the creek, but if the creek wasn't there and there's a lot of those scenarios, then you could be looking at a situation where the proposed conditions actually do exceed the existing conditions in terms of flow rates. I just didn't spend the time to kind of go through all of that for you guys. So those are the big changes you get. This is fresh for the release rate thing I've been working on with TAC, but you guys haven't seen it yet, and I haven't. These are some of the examples that I brought to them. That's why it's so labor intensive on some of the numbers. I do have, if you use current standards on the total 83 acres, you'd be looking at about a proposed release rate of about 12.45. So in this case, looking at some of these existing flows. Yes, this would be a lot less, but are we being heavy-handed considering it's a linear impervious surface? That's the other component. The static version, you're it, that's it. In situations where you don't have large impervious numbers, you're probably being heavy-handed. Flip that to large developments, maybe it's not enough. There's probably a sweet spot since it's a static number. With this, you propose more impervious, you need more reduction, you need more detention. You propose less impervious, you need less reduction, you need less detention. So it's incentivizing people to just rethink. You don't have to go to detention. Maybe you can avoid detention. Maybe it's a nice aesthetic feature that now someone can have instead of a detention basin that brings more value to their property, a nice kind of entry feature, whatever it is, it allows more opportunity, especially in like municipalities and things like that, you know, if they're looking for those type of things, et cetera, et cetera. So we feel like this is a better approach. I will, again, just let you guys know, no one is doing this. So we are gonna be different, and at the beginning part, there was a lot of hesitancy from the engineers and things like that, because obviously this is different than the way anybody's done flood storage and detention, but that's why we're running these scenarios, using these examples, seeing what the numbers look like, so we have data to back it up. We're using methodology that's been widely accepted, so we're not reinventing anything. And again, it kind of goes hand in hand with that simplified method. It's the same idea, same concept. You're not doing two different things here.
So,
Yeah.
so it sounds like, one, we're trying to help people avoid expenditures that are not really necessary. Two, we're trying to improve we're trying to gradually improve flow rates from where they are today by doing this reduction piece. And then the third thing it seems like we're trying to do is better manage the water that's coming off of all this through those first two activities.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
One thing too with the static version is we've seen rainfall intensities increase. So if you have a static number and you're saying, hey, you're only allowed to release this, at some point, you're gonna realize that's not enough because we're getting more rainfall. Whereas a reduction method, you're requiring to reduce a flow, so it can better behave with whatever the rainfall does. And it's kind of a scale. You ramp up your impervious, you ramp up the detention that you need because you need more reduction. And I think it's easier to, you know, conceptually understand that, well, if you're developing a site, you're gonna get flow increases from hard surfaces, pavements, you know, compaction, et cetera. So trying to reduce the flow from those areas as opposed to just say, well, you put a shovel in the ground, you need to add detention for that. Well, you know, do you really, is it really an impact? And so we're just trying to, yes, make sure that we have that, but be mindful that maybe it's time to update how we think about detention and move away from having more ability to do less detention basins. Maybe it's rain gardens, maybe it's, you know, terracist type ideas. Certainly those concepts have come into play. You know, something we haven't talked about is rain harvesting. There's you know, ideas where people have wanted to do that. Well, how do we capture that? Well, now we have some methods. You need to reduce the flow, but if you can capture some of it, you can apply that. So we can, you know, better incorporate some of these ideas that frankly people want to do instead of digging a hole.
Being smarter.
Yeah, I mean, you know, currently, and I'll go into the next part, we've got 340 odd detention basins we need to study in the Kishwaukee, you know, watershed alone. If we retrofit those are high-end, you know, there's a lot of maintenance required with that. Whereas going to a buffer strip, vegetated strips, filter strips, you're mowing that. It's much easier to do maintenance on it. It's part of our attempt to also enforce maintenance long-term. But there's a lot more tools in the toolbox to get around this idea of you know, making sure we're being good stewards in terms of flood management, but also giving people an ability to, you know, do what they would like with their land. Everything currently, if you read the ordinance, the next portion is it goes from, you know, the exemption, you need detention, here's the detention trigger, here's your allowable release rate, bang, straight detention basin. You know, so, you know, this concept as we finalize it, this will be kind of the first domino to fall. So like the adequate downstream capacity section will get revised. A lot of this will kind of fall into place, and we're going to have to, you know, do some more revisions as we move forward. But this is kind of the big step, or the big change, if you will. So, my pitch.
Okay. Next thing.
Okay. next thing, so I wanted to give you guys an update on our watershed planning. So what I did was I gave you a map from our consultant. So this is, I'm gonna zoom out, it's in your packet. This is the Kishwaukee River watershed here. Oh, it's in a lot, okay, we'll just go with this. All of these, and the colors don't mean anything, they're just meant to kind of help as you move along a certain river, kind of give different elements, so it's just meant to visually help see everything. But this is the, basically, miles of river or streams or ditches that we would be looking to get an assessment on. So it's about 250 miles or so, I think, roughly. As you can see, yes, we do plan on working with our Wisconsin partners, Boone County, Kane County, as part of this. Chopping it off with a hard border here didn't make sense to us. Now, Wisconsin's gonna be tricky because some of our funding comes from the IEPA, and I standing for Illinois. So just how we develop it is we've been in conversations, but you know, just wanted to give you guys an update that we're probably looking at having a proposal done by the end of March. We recently had a great presentation from Kane County for some of the flooding work that they've done. It's quite phenomenal, so we'll pick off on what they learned from that. They've actually modeled a good chunk of the southern part of McHenry County. And just to give you guys an idea, they spent about, these are very preliminary numbers, but they had a budget of $250,000 and they modeled their Fox River corridor only, which probably covers more than half of what the county would be. And that's the more, you know, sophisticated area. But that's just like a rough number from the flooding perspective. But what we would like to do is analyze these areas, use them in our flooding component, so water quality as well. And we would be developing projects throughout this entire watershed based on flooding and water quality. Sometimes the two go hand in hand. That then we would have funding opportunities as those arise. We would have grant opportunities as those arise. What we're looking to do is take advantage, so Scott is working on procuring a grant for some outreach that we would use. Part of that outreach would be to start getting the word out. Also, we would develop what we're calling a steering committee to bring all the players on board. So your municipalities, your townships, groups, the different Boone County, Kane County, and start discussing, you know, funding opportunities, share costs, discussing the numbers, and really using that to kind of help develop the structure and long-term success for these projects. The big thing is these projects are going to require a 10-year maintenance commitment. So we feel that in the municipalities, as long as they're on board, you know, they would probably look to cover that, especially if we're bringing in money to do the work for the project. A lot of it can be covered with in-kind services and things like that. So all of that is still getting fleshed out, but you know, that's kind of just wanted to give you guys an update on that. So maybe by March, I'll be able to give you guys a little bit, I don't know if it'll be a full clean document, but I'll be able to give you guys more details on where we're at with all of this. But that would be the idea, is we would do all the work and then we would move to the Fox or the Nippersink watershed, do that one next, and then so on and so forth. And ultimately, we want to have this be as a showcase, kind of an interactive viewer showing all the different projects in the different watersheds. Someone can come in, click on the status, see who's involved, do they want help, do they not, those type of opportunities. One big question for the group is going to be funding. You know, obviously we're going to try to secure as much grant money as possible, but not just funding for doing the project, but if we want some of doing the watershed planning, but for some of the individual projects in these watersheds, if it's in an area where you don't have someone that's able to step in, say a drainage district or a township or a municipality or an HOA, is there a funding mechanism to make sure that maintenance is kept up? Or do we have funding to potentially help put some of these projects through? We did write our wetland restoration fund with the ability to do that as well. So something I've been discussing with Adam is taking that wetland restoration fund and potentially investing it, and just trying to grow that and maybe draw principal off of that. We have to talk with the treasurer and all of that, but then that would be kind of a constant source that we can pull from to help fund projects, help fund wetland restoration projects and things like that. Where, I was there for the budget talks and everything, funding is gonna be a big question mark. Those would be some of the ideas that we would be looking at. Obviously, the partnerships with the municipalities, the townships, to help, but that's the latest on the watershed plan as it currently stands. So, I have some rough numbers if anybody wants them, but, nothing ironed out, so.
Well, are any of these dollars that you're thinking might cost built into the budget already?
They're not. The only dollars that are built into our current budget are related to this initial stage where we're getting the proposals together, and then the grant documents, basically be grant ready. So that's where our investment is at this point. And then it's intended to stop and kind of be there so that we can start looking at opportunities to advance.
Primary goal would be to go after what are 604B grants. Those don't require match. So any grant opportunities, funding opportunities where we don't have to match, those are gonna be priority for us. And
So the board wouldn't have to do emergency appropriations for any of this?
But
That's the question I had.
When we're done with the actual proposal, yeah, it's gonna have a dollar amount to it. We're gonna try to give you guys an idea of what funding we think we can secure through grants, which would be matched, which would be not. Part of this steering committee we're looking to do, kind of assess what the help would be from other partnerships as part of that process. And then ultimately, you guys have the keys and you can decide, how you want to move about it, how much money, and I know everybody's going to be looking at that. It's not just going to be our department looking at projects like this. So we're well aware of those issues, and that's why, part of having the wetland restoration fund and trying to invest that, and early on, maybe not pull the money and try to establish long-term success where you constantly have a funding source that won't depend on, increasing rates and things like that.
So your proposal in the future is we don't issue grants off of that restoration fund?
I think it would be my dream that we would invest enough that where the principal stays and you're drawing off interest from those investments to then use that money to fund these projects or other wetland restoration fund projects.
Okay.
That, whether or not that happens, I don't know. I've talked to Adam a little bit. We can get some of that in motion, so we'll see, but that would be my goal, because that at least is a funding mechanism that comes from developers. We've discussed if, you're triggering detention, that there could be an additional fee, right, that we collect that can be used towards that type of stuff too. So you're not necessarily drawing from property taxes and you're relying on developers. And again, with this new idea, it fits into that because there's incentives built to reduce your impervious footprint, because you'd be reducing the amount of detention, you'd be reducing the amount of those fees too. A lot of different structure, we're looking at how Lake County is doing some of their things and whatnot. So as we get into it, we'll certainly bring those ideas to the table here and, you know, you guys can.
Other than the state itself, are there any portions of McHenry County exempt from paying into that? When they do development?
The wetland restoration fund?
The state's exempt from that, correct?
Yeah, the state's exempt from permit, period.
Yeah, exactly.
So, no, yeah, and anyone that would need a permit, that a permit would be required for, would have to meet those requirements. So, you know, our MCDOT folks, that's why they're the ones at the forefront buying up wetland credits in any banks available. That's the reason why they're doing it, is because they're the ones that you only have so much right of way. And when you need to make improvements, some things you gotta give, because you're talking about, you know, life safety with vehicles, and they need to make sure that their design, you know, shoulder width, whatever it is, there's sometimes you can't avoid wetland impacts. And so.
Okay.
I didn't quite understand your point. I thought anybody, in terms of the state, because I thought anybody who impacts wetlands, because the whole idea, I don't know where that comes from in terms of the
Well,
total.
the state, my point was Route 47 example, the state doesn't have to purchase wetland.
From us?
Yes.
No.
Not from
because-
us, but they would have to still provide for mitigation of wetlands, because it's,
Right, I'm saying,
Oh, well, from us
I'm talking
personally,
about
yeah.
for
Yeah, okay.
takeaway funds from us.
okay, thank you, I wasn't clear.
Yeah, and I mean, in terms of permitting fees, you know, any municipality, government agency, they're exempt from those fees, but they wouldn't be exempt from the mitigation component.
And refresh my memory, how much is currently in our wetland fund? Not very much.
About 53,
Yeah, it's
54.
Yeah.
Yeah,
just sub.
53, 54. So I, you know, and I don't know if currently, you know, the treasurer is investing that money, but that's something that I would like to see. I think it makes sense. I know it's dedicated, you know, this body, PED specifically, has, you know, authority over that and dependent, you know, releasing money. So I think if we want to think long-term sustainability, I think we try to grow that money and draw off the interest for, you know, funding opportunities.
Are there any projects in the near future that you see contributing toward that fund?
Yeah, potentially some of these solar farms.
Okay.
You know, there, as you mentioned, Jim, the kind of the better areas in the county are getting taken up, right? So now they're left with, and it's not to say they're looking for it. It could be the farmer that's just tired of trying to farm a wetter area and not getting, you know, certainly they have a right, you know, to make the best decision for themselves. So they might go try to convince a solar farm to build in that area. Well, depending on the type of wetland it is, certainly we're treating farmed wetlands different than regular wetlands, but there are some situations where we're basically saying, well, stay out, or you have to, well, first and foremost, you have to try to avoid, minimize. Then, you know, you have to, we couldn't exclude an application in for a request for the wetland restoration fund, but we certainly, much like the LaSalle factors, there are criteria as to, you know, acceptance to that. But those would be, you know, straight off the bat, the projects that I can think of. Unless you have like a subdivision area or something like that, but I think in those cases, most developers would be looking to avoid those because they're heavy costs. You know, the recent one we saw, it was a mining development. They're looking to mine in that area, so for them it might make sense because they can recoup, you know, that money that would be required, or that they're paying into the fund.
Okay.
So outside of that, I mean, I think, let's see, that was, or at least from the history that I've seen, was established in 2010 with the most current edition. There have been 5 total payments into that. And I think the previous 3 or 4 have been all MCDOT. So I guess MCDOT projects would be, you know, another example, and that's just due to any widening or, you know, township again. Will be required as part of that process. So those would be the type of projects that I would say would have the highest likelihood.
Right.
Given the
Okay.
track record too, like I said, there's 5, maybe 6 times that in, 15 years, 16 years? So I just think that, it's trying to invest that and grow that. We're gonna have very little opportunity to do that, and when it is an opportunity to have some sustainable funding for some of these type of measures long-term.
Okay,
Just kind of comment on that.
Carolyn.
So I know that some of these projects or these companies coming in are solar community focused, and they will donate to different organizations, sometimes, whatever, maybe environmental defenders, or whatever it is, but maybe there's an opportunity there. I don't know about in our wetland restoration fund, how that would look, but maybe towards future projects or something like that, especially if they're impacting. And can I just go really quickly back to our discussion in terms of using our UDOs, stormwater management? I don't know how, like as you're talking about, as these projects get more into wetlands and areas where we have a lot of tree cover, we don't have any way to say to them right now. I mean, we're talking about wetlands and how they can mitigate that through this process. But I'm wondering, like, so if they take, so as they're going into more areas where there's more trees, if they were to take those trees out, wouldn't that, and if you're looking at the total flow, wouldn't that impact the flow?
Yeah, it would. And so with these new requirements, we would be looking at that.
So that could impact how many they can pull, that might help guide how many we can control or have some say over how many of these trees are being removed now, especially in these areas where there's more wets and whatever.
Yeah, we did have one, I don't think it's been scheduled for CUP that did come in, and as you know, one of the LaSalle factors is trying to avoid those type of areas. Our comment back was, they just made the statement, but they weren't showing that. And so I don't know what resulted of that, but that was our comment back to zoning, like, hey, before you schedule this, you might want to provide a better explanation of how they're meeting this specific LaSalle factor for that. But, and when it comes to wetland areas specifically, like I said, avoidance, minimization, if it's, well, we need to go through here because this is the only area common is letting us connect to. That might be like, okay, well, that sounds more reasonable than, well, it's the whatever, something like that would have to factor in, again, in my opinion, for staff at least to say, we would consider, fee in lieu of into the wetland restoration fund.
I'm just thinking of things that we can utilize on the back end, how to have a little bit more control, that's all.
We'll be looking to do some SMO-specific solar farm rewrites here. So you guys are definitely gonna get an opportunity, and we can definitely discuss and figure out, and at that point, I'm sure ask the state's attorney if, that's the one thing I don't know is that, we have a state statute that allows us to implement stormwater management on a countywide basis. You have another state statute that says you can allow solar farms, so I don't know how those two, is there a priority, are they the same, and so the things we're talking about are during the permitting process, so we're not trying to slow down their conditional use approval, but they certainly have to meet the stormwater requirements, and if these are our requirements, then you have to meet them. And if you don't get a permit, so even though you got a conditional use approval, and that's generally how I try to state any conditional use is, hey, you're gonna need to do some homework. I'm not saying you do it now, because I don't know if ZBA is gonna approve you, but just note that although you get approval, you still need to meet permit requirements. If you fail to do so, you're not gonna get a permit. And you can't move forward with your development, so.
Okay. Future topics. Anybody else have anything?
You had your one you wanted to
Okay.
push.
Any announcements that we need to know, that we haven't already discussed? Motion to adjourn. Carl Kaminsky, John Collins seconds. All those in favor, aye?
Aye.
Thank you for all your time today, folks.
Hey.
Yeah.